Sometimes a man reaches a point where he has to prove he's still worth something, even if it means risking everything he has left. For Duncan Merrill, that moment came when he spent his last savings on a crumbling castle everyone called worthless. His family thought he'd lost his mind. The townspeople laughed behind his back. At 53, divorced and struggling, Duncan didn't look like someone making a smart choice. But as he and his son cleaned years of moss and debris, they discovered carved beams, rare stained glass, and a forgotten mural. When an expert appraised the castle at over $9 million, the whole town went silent. But the real question wasn't about the money. It was about what happens when a father finally gets the chance to prove himself. Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, subscribe, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Duncan Merrill sat on the edge of his rented twin bed, staring at the laptop screen that cast a pale glow across the cramped studio apartment. It was 2 a.m, and sleep had become a stranger to him over the past 6 months. The divorce papers were finally signed. His construction business was 3 years gone, and at 53, he was living in a place smaller than his old tool shed. The apartment belonged to that particular category of dwelling that landlords called cozy and everyone else called desperate. One room serving as bedroom, living room, and office. A kitchenette with a hot plate and a mini fridge that hummed like a dying hornet. A bathroom so small you had to step into the shower to close the door. Boxes he hadn't unpacked lined the walls, remnants of a life he'd dismantled piece by piece. Duncan's hands, calloused and thick from decades of construction work, moved a mouse across the screen. He'd been scrolling through real estate listings for hours, not because he could afford anything, but because it was better than lying awake counting his failures. The 2008 recession had taken his business. The years of struggle afterward had taken his marriage. Now he was working as a handyman, picking up whatever jobs he could find, watching his savings account dwindle toward zero. In his wallet, wedged behind his driver's license, was a photograph so worn the edges had gone soft. It showed a younger Duncan standing beside his father at a construction site, both of them covered in dust, both of them grinning. His father had built houses for 40 years, taught Duncan everything he knew about reading wood grain and setting foundations true. "Any fool can slap up walls," his father used to say, "but a craftsman builds something that lasts." Duncan hadn't built anything lasting in years. His ex-wife Paulette had remarried 4 months ago. The wedding photos showed up on social media. Her new husband, Stanford, owned 3 car dealerships across the county. Duncan's brother-in-law, Virgil, never missed an opportunity to mention it. Stanford this, Stanford that. Man knows how to provide for a family. The implication hung in the air like smoke, unlike you. His son Garrett was 28 now, making a living as a freelance graphic designer. They texted occasionally, short exchanges about nothing important. The distance between them had grown over the years, each of Duncan's failures adding another layer of silence. Garrett had stopped asking his father for advice around the time the business folded. Duncan couldn't blame him. The listing that changed everything appeared at 2:47 a.m. Historic castle for sale, Thornhill Keep, built 1887, needs extensive restoration. $47,000. The photographs showed a Gothic revival structure covered in moss and ivy, windows broken or boarded, stonework weathered, but still standing. It sat on 12 acres outside a small town called Millersport, population 3 to 200, about 90 miles north. The listing had been active for 8 months, with no offers. Duncan clicked through the photos. Despite the decay, despite the obvious damage, something about the building spoke to him. The lines were good. The proportions were right. Whoever had built this hadn't been cutting corners. He could see it in the stone arches, the tower rising from the eastern corner, the careful placement of the windows. This had been built by someone who understood structure, who cared about craft. He looked at his bank account. $42,000. Everything he had left. The sensible thing would be to close the laptop, go to bed, forget he'd ever seen it. He had a sister, Francine, who would happily explain why this was a terrible idea. She was practical, grounded, married to a man who managed a hardware store and drove the same truck for 15 years. They had a good life, a steady life, the kind Duncan used to have before everything fell apart. But sitting in that tiny apartment surrounded by boxes he couldn't bring himself to unpack, Duncan felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not hope exactly, but something close to it. A flicker of possibility. A whisper that maybe he wasn't quite done yet. He picked up his phone and called the real estate agent. 3 days later, Duncan stood in front of Thornhill Keep for the first time. The agent, a woman named Priscilla with lacquered hair and a pursed smile, had driven him out from town. She kept her distance from the building, as if decay might be contagious. "It's been vacant since the late 70s, she said. Family dispute over the estate. Took decades to settle. By the time the title cleared, well, you can see what happened." Duncan could see. Vegetation had claimed the lower walls. Several windows on the second floor were missing entirely. Part of the roof had collapsed on the western wing. Birds nested in the eaves. But underneath all that neglect, the bones were solid. The foundation hadn't shifted. The main tower stood straight. The Gothic arches over the entrance were intact. "Most folks who look at it see a tear-down," Priscilla continued. "The land's worth something, at least. Could clear it, subdivide maybe." Duncan walked closer, running his hand along the stonework. The blocks were massive, fitted together with the kind of precision you didn't see anymore. This was old-world craftsmanship, built when time and skill mattered more than speed. "I'll take it," he said. Priscilla blinked. "Don't you want to see the interior?" "I've seen enough." The closing took 2 weeks. Duncan signed the papers in Priscilla's office while she kept glancing at him, like he might suddenly come to his senses. He withdrew every dollar from his savings account and handed over a cashier's check. When she gave him the keys, heavy iron things that looked medieval, her smile was sympathetic. "Good luck, Mr. Merrill. You're going to need it." That evening, Duncan called Garrett. His son answered on the 4th ring, sounding distracted. "Hey, Dad, what's up?" "I bought a castle." Silence on the other end. "Then you what?" "A castle." "Well, technically it's called a keep. Built in 1887, needs some work. I was thinking maybe you could come see it this weekend." More silence. Duncan could picture Garrett rubbing his temples the way he did when he was trying to process something unexpected. "Dad, are you okay? Is this some kind of midlife crisis thing?" "I'm 53. That ship sailed. Then what is this?" Duncan looked around his tiny apartment, at the boxes and the narrow bed, and the life he'd been barely living. "It's a project. I need a project. And I could use some help." Garrett sighed. "Text me the address. I'll drive up Saturday." When Duncan told his sister about the purchase, Francine and her husband came over immediately. They stood in his apartment looking at the listing photos on his laptop like they were evidence at a crime scene. "Duncan, this is insane," Francine said. "You spent your entire savings on a ruin." "It's not a ruin. It's a restoration opportunity. It's a pile of rocks with windows," her husband muttered. Francine sat down beside him, her voice gentler. "I know things have been hard. The divorce, the business, all of it. But this doesn't feel like you thinking clearly." "Maybe that's the problem," Duncan said. "Maybe I've been thinking too clearly, thinking myself into a corner. Playing it safe until safe was just another word for stuck. And you think buying a derelict castle is unstuck?" Duncan looked at the photos again, the moss-covered stones, the broken windows, the tower reaching toward the sky. "I think it's something, and something is better than nothing." Saturday morning, Garrett pulled up in his aging sedan. He'd driven up from the city, and the expression on his face when he saw Thornhill Keep was somewhere between disbelief and concern. "Dad," he said slowly, "what have you done?" They stood together in front of the building. Up close, the decay was more apparent. Crumbling mortar, sections of wall streaked with water damage, weeds growing from the gutters. But the morning light caught the remaining stained glass in one of the chapel windows, throwing colored patterns across the overgrown courtyard. "I know what you're thinking," Duncan said. "I don't think you do. You're thinking your old man finally lost it. Threw away his last dollar on a fantasy." Garrett didn't deny it. "Something like that." Duncan pulled out the iron keys. "Come inside before you judge." Let me show you what I see. They pushed open the heavy wooden door, miraculously still intact, and stepped into the main hall. Dust motes swirled in the shafts of light, coming through gaps in the roof. The floor was littered with debris, and the smell of mold hung heavy in the air. But the space itself was magnificent. The ceiling soared 20 feet high. Stone columns supported Gothic arches. A massive fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel carved with intricate details. Garrett turned slowly, taking it all in. His skepticism hadn't disappeared, but something else flickered across his face. Curiosity, maybe, or the faintest hint of possibility. It's bigger than I expected, he admitted. 12,000 square feet, according to the listing. And you plan to restore all of it? I plan to start, one room at a time. See where it goes. They explored deeper into the building, their footsteps echoing on stone floors. Some rooms were nearly destroyed, but others had weathered the decades surprisingly well. The library still had its built-in bookshelves. The ballroom's plaster walls were damaged, but not beyond repair. In what must have been the study, they found a desk buried under decades of dust and bird droppings. Garrett wiped away the grime to reveal dark wood with brass fittings. This stuff is old, he said. Like actually valuable old. That's what I'm hoping. Garrett looked at his father, really looked at him, maybe for the first time in years. You're serious about this? I am. Why? Duncan considered the question. He could talk about the craftsmanship, about the potential value, about the challenge of restoration. But the truth was simpler and harder to explain. Because when I stand here, I don't feel 53 and washed up. I feel like maybe I've got one more thing left in me. One more chance to build something that matters. Garrett was quiet for a long moment. Then he pulled out his phone and started taking pictures. Okay, show me what needs to be done first. They spent the rest of the day assessing the damage, making lists, planning the work. As the sun set and they locked up the castle, Duncan felt something he hadn't felt in years, not quite hope, but its first cousin, the sense that tomorrow might be different from today. Garrett paused beside his car. I can come back next weekend, help you get started on the cleanup. You don't have to do that. I know. Garrett met his father's eyes, but maybe I want to. Then, after his son drove away, Duncan stood alone in front of Thornhill Keep. The evening light softened the building's rough edges, and for a moment he could see past the decay to what it had once been, what it might be again. Any fool could see a ruin, but a craftsman could see the bones underneath, solid and true, just waiting for someone to believe in them again. Duncan believed. The first week of work began with Duncan and Garrett hauling trash. Decades of abandonment had left Thornhill Keep, filled with debris, rotted furniture, broken glass, animal nests, and layers of leaves that had blown in through broken windows. They wore dust masks and work gloves, filling contractor bags and dragging them to a rented dumpster. The physical labor felt good to Duncan. His muscles remembered this rhythm, the steady satisfaction of making visible progress. Garrett worked beside him without complaint, though Duncan could see his son checking his phone whenever they took breaks, fielding messages from clients, juggling freelance deadlines. On the fourth day, Francine called to announce a family dinner. "Everyone wants to see you," she said, her tone suggesting this wasn't optional. The gathering was at Francine's house, a comfortable ranch-style home with a manicured lawn and a dining room that smelled of pot roast. Duncan arrived to find the usual crowd. Francine and her husband, his ex-wife Paulette with Stanford, and Virgil holding court with a glass of bourbon. Virgil spotted Duncan first. "Here he is, the Castle King himself. How's your fortress, Duncan?" "Keeping the dragons at bay." Polite laughter rippled around the room. Duncan accepted a beer from Francine and settled into a chair, bracing himself. "I heard you actually bought that place," Stanford said. He had the kind of smile that came from never doubting himself. "The old Wickham property. Been abandoned for what, 40 years? "About 50, Duncan said. "What's your plan with it? Flip it? Restore it?" Virgil nearly choked on his drink. "Restore it? Duncan, that place is condemned. The county should have bulldozed it years ago. The structure's sound. It just needs work." "It needs a wrecking ball," Virgil said. "And you need your head examined. You threw away your last dollar on a pile of rocks." Paulette set down her wine glass. "Duncan, I'm worried about you. This doesn't seem like a rational decision. Have you talked to anyone? A therapist, maybe?" The words stung more than Virgil's mockery. The concern in her voice, the suggestion that he was having some kind of breakdown, it hit exactly where she knew it would hurt. "I'm fine, Paulette. Are you? Because from where I'm sitting, this looks like a man who's given up on reality." Before Duncan could respond, Garrett spoke up from across the room. "He hasn't given up on anything." Everyone turned. Garrett rarely spoke at these gatherings, usually content to observe from the margins. "I've been helping him this week," Garrett continued. "And yeah, the place needs work. A lot of work, but it's not what you're all saying. The craftsmanship is incredible. The bones are solid. Dad sees something there. Your father sees what he wants to see," Virgil said. "Just like he saw that. Construction business working out, just like—" "That's enough," Francine cut in. "We're not here to pile on." But the damage was done. The rest of the dinner passed in strained conversation, everyone carefully avoiding the topic of the castle while it hung over everything like smoke. When Duncan left, Paulette followed him to his truck. "I didn't mean to embarrass you in there," she said. "Didn't you?" She sighed. "I genuinely am worried. You're living in that tiny apartment, working odd jobs, and now this. It feels like you're circling the drain. Maybe I'm climbing out of it instead. Or maybe you're in denial." She touched his arm, a gesture that once would have meant comfort. Now it just felt patronizing. "Stanford knows some people. Business advisors, career counselors, someone who could help you figure out what's next." Duncan looked at her, this woman he'd been married to for 26 years, and realized she'd never really understood him. Not the part that mattered. "I've already figured out what's next," he said. "It's the castle." He drove back to Thornhill Keep that night, arriving near midnight. The buildings stood dark against darker sky, but moonlight caught the edges of the tower. Duncan let himself in and sat in the empty main hall, his back against the stone wall. The silence here was different from the silence of his apartment. Not empty, full of history, of craftsmanship, of stories layered into the stones over a century. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through the photos Garrett had taken, seeing the details his son had captured. The carved corbels, the intact tilework in one hallway, the way light fell through the damaged roof in geometric patterns. His phone buzzed with a text from Garrett. "Don't let them get to you, we'll show them." Duncan smiled in the darkness. When had his son started defending him? When had that shift happened? The next morning, they discovered something that changed everything. They'd been working in what Duncan thought was the study, a room with built-in shelves and a massive desk they'd uncovered beneath years of debris. Garrett was photographing the woodwork when his foot hit something loose in the floor. A board shifted, revealing a gap beneath. "Dad, there's something under here." They pried up several floorboards carefully, exposing a small cavity. Inside was a leather-bound book, surprisingly well-preserved in its hidden space. Duncan lifted it out, his hands trembling slightly. The cover was embossed, "Thornhill Keep, Construction Ledger, 1887. They carried it to the window where light was better. The pages were yellowed but readable, filled with meticulous handwriting documenting every detail of the castle's construction. Materials ordered, craftsmen hired, costs recorded, but it was the notes in the margins that made Duncan's breath catch. Windows, commissioned from L.C. Tiffany Studio, New York. Cost, $4,200. Oak beams, Heinrich Vogel, master carpenter. Brought from Germany specifically for this project. Ballroom mural, Maximilian Cross to paint allegorical scenes. Contract, $8,000. Page after page revealed that Thornhill Keep hadn't been built by some eccentric millionaire playing at nobility. It had been constructed with serious money and serious talent. The original owner, a man named Ambrose Wickham, had spared no expense. "Dad," Garrett said slowly, "do you know who Maximilian Cross was?" "Should I?" Garrett was already on his phone, searching. "He was famous. His murals are in museums. If there's actually a cross-painting somewhere in this building, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They spent the rest of the day searching for evidence of the things mentioned in the ledger. The oak beams were visible in several rooms, massive timbers with carved details. In one ceiling, Duncan found a maker's mark burned into the wood, a distinctive symbol that matched the description of Heinrich Vogel's signature. The windows mentioned in the ledger were another story. Most were broken or missing entirely. But in a small room that must have been a chapel, they found something remarkable. Someone had boarded over the windows decades ago, probably to protect them from vandals. Behind the boards, the glass was intact. Duncan and Garrett carefully removed the boards. Afternoon light poured through stained glass, depicting medieval scenes, knights and ladies, castles and forests, all rendered in jewel-toned glass with the kind of detail that made Duncan's chest tight. "These are real Tiffany windows," Garrett whispered. "Do you know what these are worth?" Duncan did some rough math in his head. He'd seen a documentary once about Tiffany glass. Even small pieces sold for thousands. These were full windows, intact, documented in the original construction records. "We need an expert," he said. "Someone who can verify all this." They took photographs of everything, the ledger, the windows, the carved beams, every detail they could document. Garrett posted a few carefully chosen images to his social media, with the caption, "Hidden treasure in an abandoned castle. Story developing." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Restoration enthusiasts, history buffs, and architecture lovers flooded the comments. Within hours, one message stood out from the rest. "I'm Dr. Imogen Fairchild with the State Historical Society. If these photos are genuine, you may have one of the most significant examples of Gilded Age architecture in the region. I'd like to visit as soon as possible." Duncan read the message 3 times. Then he looked at Garrett, who was grinning. "Still think I'm crazy?" Duncan asked. "Oh, you're definitely crazy," Garrett said. "But maybe crazy in a good way." That evening, back in his apartment, Duncan opened the ledger again. He read Ambrose Wickham's notes, the careful documentation of every decision, every expense. This had been a labor of love for Wickham, not just vanity. Every page revealed someone who understood quality, who valued craftsmanship, who wanted to create something that would last. Duncan understood that impulse. It was the same thing that had drawn him to construction decades ago. The desire to build something solid, something real, something that would outlast the builder. He pulled out the worn photograph of himself and his father. "Any fool can slap up walls," his father had said. "But a craftsman builds something that lasts." Maybe Duncan was about to prove he was still a craftsman after all. His phone rang. It was Francine. "Virgil just called me," she said. "He saw Garrett's posts. He's telling everyone you found something valuable in that castle." "Maybe I did." "Duncan, please be careful. Don't get your hopes up too high." But Duncan's hopes were already climbing, and for the first time in years, he was going to let them. Dr. Imogen Fairchild arrived on a Tuesday morning in a sensible sedan, carrying a leather satchel that looked older than Duncan. She was late 50s, grey hair pulled back in a practical bun, and the kind of focused intensity that came from decades of scholarship. She shook Duncan's hand with a firm grip and got straight to business. "Show me everything." They spent 4 hours touring Thornhill Keep. Fairchild photographed obsessively, took measurements, made notes in a leather journal, and occasionally stopped to run her fingers along stonework or woodwork with an expression Duncan couldn't quite read. Garrett followed with his camera, documenting her documentation. In the chapel room, she stood in front of the Tiffany windows for a full 10 minutes without speaking. The afternoon light came through the glass, throwing colored patterns across her face. "These are authentic," she finally said. "The technique, the leading, the way the glass is layered, this is Tiffany Studios' work. Probably from their most productive period in the late 1880s. Are they valuable?" Duncan asked, though he already knew the answer. Valuable doesn't begin to cover it. A single Tiffany window panel this size could fetch hundreds of thousands at auction. "You have 6 complete windows here." She turned to look at him. "Mr. Merrill, do you understand what you've stumbled into?" Duncan felt something shift in his chest. Validation, maybe, or vindication. "I'm starting to." They moved to the main hall where the oak beams were most visible. Fairchild climbed a ladder to examine the maker's mark up close, taking photos with a professional camera. "Heinrich Vogel," she said, half to herself. "I've seen his work in 2 buildings, the Richter Estate in Pennsylvania and the Old Merchants Exchange in Baltimore. Both are national landmarks now. His craftsmanship is unmistakable." She climbed down and consulted the construction ledger Duncan had given her. According to this, Wickham brought Vogel over from Germany specifically for this project. That level of commitment suggests this wasn't just a vanity project. Wickham was building something meant to last centuries. "It almost made it," Garrett said. "Another decade or 2 abandoned, and it would have been too far gone." Fairchild nodded. "You got here just in time. The structure is sound, but water damage will eventually compromise everything. You need to address the roof immediately." Duncan had already come to that conclusion, but hearing it from an expert made it more urgent. "How much are we talking? For proper restoration?" "Hundreds of thousands, minimum. But Mr. Merrill," she fixed him with a serious look, "what you have here is potentially worth millions. The Tiffany windows alone, the Vogel woodwork, the architectural significance. If even half of what's documented in this ledger still exists in this building, you're sitting on a gold mine." After Fairchild left, promising to send a preliminary report within the week, Duncan and Garrett sat in the castle's old kitchen area, eating sandwiches and processing what they'd just learned. "Millions," Garrett said. "She actually said millions. She said potentially." Still, Garrett unwrapped his sandwich but didn't eat it. "Dad, what are you going to do?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, if this place is worth what she thinks it's worth, you could sell it. Get your life back on track. Buy a real house. Restart the business, whatever you want." Duncan looked around the kitchen, at the exposed beams overhead, the old stone sink, the way afternoon light slanted through the high windows. "What if I don't want to sell it? Then what? You can't restore this whole place yourself. You just heard her, hundreds of thousands in repairs. Maybe I find investors. Maybe I take out a loan against the value. Or maybe you're getting ahead of yourself." Garrett's voice was gentle but firm. "One step at a time, right? First we need that report. Then we figure out what's really here. Then we make decisions." Duncan knew his son was right, but something had shifted in him since finding the ledger. The castle wasn't just a desperate gamble anymore. It was real. It was valuable. It was proof that his instincts hadn't completely failed him. They spent the next 2 weeks working dawn to dusk. Duncan taught Garrett things he'd learned from his father: how to read wood grain, how to identify load-bearing structures, how to preserve while you repair. Garrett proved to be a quick study, and more importantly, he seemed genuinely engaged. They cleared the main hall completely, revealing the full scope of the space. The stone floor, once cleaned, showed an intricate pattern. The fireplace mantel, stripped of decades of soot, revealed carved details, heraldic symbols, Celtic knots, flourishes that spoke of someone's vision and someone else's skill. One morning, while removing damaged plaster from a wall in the library, Garrett's pry bar hit something solid. They carefully exposed a hidden compartment built into the stonework. Inside was a small wooden box, surprisingly intact. Duncan lifted it out carefully. The box was cedar, dovetailed joints, the kind of craftsmanship that matched everything else in the castle. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were letters. They were written in careful script on heavy paper, dated from 1886 to 1888. Letters from Ambrose Wickham to his wife Eleanor, written while he was overseeing the castle's construction. Duncan and Garrett sat on the library floor, dust motes floating in the air around them, and read the words of a man dead over a century. The letters painted a picture neither of them had expected. Wickham's first wife had died in childbirth years before. The castle, he wrote, was meant as a memorial to her, a place of beauty built from grief. He remarried eventually, and his second wife Eleanor tried to make the castle a home, but the letters revealed Wickham's heart had never fully healed. "My dearest Eleanor," one letter read, "you ask why I insist on such expense for windows that may never be properly admired. But I believe beauty is its own justification. Margaret loved beautiful things, stained glass especially. Every window in this place is a prayer I could not speak when she was dying. You understand this, I think, and love me despite the ghost I cannot quite release." Duncan's throat felt tight. He carefully folded the letter and placed it back in the box. "He built a whole castle as a memorial," Garrett said quietly. "That's either the most romantic thing I've ever heard or the saddest. Maybe both." They sat in silence for a while. Then Garrett asked, "Do you ever feel like that? Like you're building something because of what you lost?" Duncan considered the question. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm building something because I need to prove I can still build at all." "You don't have anything to prove, Dad." "Don't I?" Duncan stood brushing dust from his jeans. "Your mother remarried a successful man. Virgil never misses a chance to remind me I failed. Even Francine looks at me with pity sometimes. Everyone thinks I'm washed up. I don't think that." Duncan met his son's eyes. "You did. A month ago you thought I'd lost my mind buying this place." Garrett didn't deny it. "Maybe I did. But I was wrong. You saw something everyone else missed. That takes vision, not delusion." The words settled into Duncan like warmth. When had his son started seeing him clearly again? Dr. Fairchild's preliminary report arrived via email that evening. Duncan read it on his phone while sitting in his apartment, Garrett looking over his shoulder. The report was thorough, technical, and concluded with an estimate that made Duncan's hands shake. Based on documented elements and confirmed attributions, Thornhill Keep represents a significant example of Gilded Age architecture with authenticated works by multiple renowned craftsmen. Conservative auction estimates for major elements: Tiffany windows, 800,000, 1.28. Vogel structural woodwork, 600,000, 900,000. Architectural salvage and period fixtures, 400,000, 600,000. Property value with historical designation, 2.3 million. Total estimated value, 3.8, 5.7 meter. Recommend immediate historical landmark application and comprehensive professional appraisal. "Dad," Garrett said, "do you see that number?" Duncan saw it. He just couldn't quite believe it yet. His phone rang. It was Francine. "Duncan, Virgil just heard from someone at the Historical Society. Is it true? Is your castle really worth millions?" "Maybe. We don't know for sure yet." "Oh my God, Duncan, do you know what this means?" He did know. It meant he'd been right. It meant the gamble had paid off. It meant 53 wasn't too late after all. But as he looked around his cramped apartment at the life he'd been barely living, Duncan realized something else. The money mattered less than the fact that he'd trusted himself. He'd seen what others couldn't see, believed when others mocked, built when others said to quit. That was worth more than any appraisal. News traveled fast in a town the size of Millersport. Within days of Dr. Fairchild's preliminary report, Duncan found himself the subject of speculation at the hardware store, the diner, and apparently every coffee shop conversation in the county. The man who'd been quietly mocked for buying a ruin was suddenly interesting. Horace, who owned the hardware store, greeted Duncan with new respect when he came in for supplies. "Heard you struck gold up there at the old Wickham place. That true?" "It's looking promising," Duncan said carefully. "Well, I'll be damned. Everyone thought you were crazy." Horace rang up the order and then leaned across the counter. "Between you and me, I always thought that castle had good bones. Just needed someone with vision to see it." Duncan suspected Horace's memory was adjusting itself, but he accepted the compliment graciously. At the diner, Betsy poured his coffee with extra attention. "On the house, Mr. Merrill. Figure a man who can spot a multi-million-dollar opportunity deserves a free refill." Even Priscilla, the real estate agent who'd sold him the property, called to congratulate him. "I had no idea what that property was actually worth," she admitted. "If I'd known, I would have—" She stopped herself. "Well, I'm happy for you. Really!" But it was Virgil's reaction that Duncan had been dreading most. His brother-in-law showed up at the castle unannounced on a Saturday afternoon, driving a luxury SUV that cost more than Duncan's annual income. He stepped out wearing pressed khakis and a polo shirt, looking around with an expression that had shifted from mockery to calculation. "Duncan," he approached with extended hand and wide smile. Heard the good news. Remarkable turn of events. Virgil. Duncan shook his hand warily. Listen, I wanted to apologize for what I said at dinner. I should have had more faith in you. You always did have an eye for value. The sudden revision of history was almost comical. Duncan glanced at Garrett, who was watching from the castle entrance with poorly concealed amusement. Anyway, Virgil continued, I've been thinking. A windfall like this requires proper financial management. I know some excellent advisors, investment consultants, people who could help you maximize this opportunity. I'd be happy to make some introductions. There it was. The real reason for the visit. I appreciate that, Duncan said evenly, but I'm not making any decisions yet. Of course. Just want you to know the resources are available. Family should help family, right? Virgil glanced at the castle. Mind if I take a look inside? I'd love to see what all the fuss is about. Duncan minded very much, but refusing would have been petty. He gave Virgil a brief tour, watching his brother-in-law's eyes assess every detail with the practiced evaluation of someone calculating resale value. After Virgil left, Garrett joined Duncan in the main hall. That was painful to watch. He means well, Duncan said, not believing it. He means to get his hands on some of that money. Garrett paused. You're not actually going to use his consultants, are you? Not a chance. They returned to work, focusing on the library. The built-in bookshelves needed cleaning and minor repairs, but the craftsmanship was extraordinary. Each shelf precisely fitted, the joints invisible, the wood aged to a deep honey color. Duncan ran his hand along the surface, feeling the smoothness that only hand-planing could achieve. I've been thinking, Garrett said as he worked, about what happens next. With the castle, I mean. And, well, Dr. Fairchild said you need hundreds of thousands for proper restoration. Even with the value established, that's a lot of capital. Are you thinking of selling? Taking out a loan? Finding investors? Duncan had been avoiding this question, even in his own thoughts. I don't know yet. Part of me wants to see the restoration through, but the practical part knows I can't afford that. What if we did it differently? Garrett set down his cleaning rag. What if instead of trying to restore everything at once, we focus on stabilization? Fix the roof, secure the windows, prevent further damage, document everything properly. Then maybe turn it into something that generates income. Like what? I don't know. A museum, an event space, something. There's got to be a way to make this place support itself while honoring what it is. The idea had merit, but Duncan felt resistance rising. That sounds like a lot of work for an uncertain payoff, as opposed to what you're doing now. Garrett smiled. Dad, you bought an abandoned castle with your last dollar. Uncertain payoffs are kind of your thing. Duncan couldn't argue with that. They worked until sunset, making visible progress on the library. As they packed up tools, Garrett's phone rang. He answered, listened, and his expression shifted to something Duncan couldn't quite read. Yeah, she's here. I'll ask. He covered the phone. It's a photographer from the city. She's been following the story online and wants to do a feature on the restoration. Offered to pay for the shoot. Tell her no. Dad, it's good publicity. And honestly, we could use the money. Duncan hesitated. He'd always been private, uncomfortable with attention. But Garrett was right. Additional income would help with restoration costs. Fine, but you handle the coordination. Over the next week, the photographer came and spent 2 days shooting the castle. Her name was Simone, and she approached the project with an artist's eye. Capturing details Duncan had stopped noticing, the way light fell through broken windows, the patterns of moss on stone, the contrast between decay and craftsmanship. Garrett spent considerable time showing her around, explaining the history, pointing out significant details. Duncan noticed the way his son's enthusiasm came through when he talked about the castle, how he'd internalized the story of the place. When had Garrett become invested in this project? When had it stopped being Duncan's gamble and become something they were building together? One evening, after Simone had left for the day, Duncan and Garrett sat in the library, sharing takeout Chinese food. The room was clean now, the shelves restored, the windows letting in soft twilight. I've been meaning to tell you something, Garrett said. My freelance work has been slow lately. Really slow. I've been living off savings for the past 3 months. Duncan set down his food. Why didn't you say something? Because you had your own problems. But now, he gestured around the library, I'm thinking maybe this could be something. For both of us, if we play it right. Garrett, this is my project, my risk. I don't want you betting your future on something uncertain. Maybe I want to take that bet. Maybe I'm tired of playing it safe, living in the city, designing logos for companies I don't care about. Maybe I want to build something that matters. Garrett met his father's eyes. Maybe I learned that from you. The words hit Duncan harder than any validation from experts or town gossip. His son, his careful, practical son, was choosing to risk alongside him. All right, Duncan said quietly. Partners, then. We figure this out together. They shook hands across the takeout containers, sealing something more significant than a business arrangement. That night, back in his apartment, Duncan received an email from Dr. Fairchild with a subject line that made his pulse quicken. Major discovery. Need to discuss immediately. He opened it with trembling fingers. Mr. Merrill, I've been researching the construction ledger more thoroughly. There are references to a commissioned mural by Maximilian Cross in the ballroom. Cross was one of the most prominent American muralists of the Gilded Age. His works hang in museums across the country. If this mural exists and is intact, it could be worth more than everything else in the castle combined. We need to examine the ballroom walls immediately. Please call me as soon as you receive this. Duncan read the email 3 times. Then he called Garrett. Dad, it's 11 at night. I know, but you need to read the email Fairchild just sent. And then you need to come to the castle first thing tomorrow morning. What's going on? Duncan looked at the email again, at the words that might change everything. I think we're about to find out if we've been sitting on a masterpiece. Dr. Fairchild arrived the next morning with 3 graduate students, professional lighting equipment, and an intensity that made Duncan's nerves hum. They gathered in the ballroom, a cavernous space on the 2nd floor that Duncan and Garrett had barely touched. The walls were covered in layers of damaged plaster, water-stained and crumbling in places. Maximilian Cross worked almost exclusively on commission for wealthy patrons, Fairchild explained, as her students set up lights. His murals typically depicted allegorical scenes, classical themes rendered in a romantic style. According to the ledger, Wickham paid him $8,000 in 1887. That's equivalent to over $200,000 today. For that money, Cross would have created something significant. She approached the eastern wall and ran her hand along the plaster. The question is whether it survived. Water damage, time, vandalism, any of those could have destroyed it. How do we find out? Garrett asked. Carefully. Fairchild produced a small knife and a brush. We remove the plaster in test sections. If there's painting underneath, we'll see pigment or prepared surface. The work was painstakingly slow. They started in a corner where water damage was minimal, removing plaster inch by inch. Duncan watched, hardly breathing, as Fairchild worked with surgical precision. The graduate students documented every step with photographs and notes. 2 hours in, Fairchild stopped. Look at this. Beneath the plaster was a layer of canvas, and on that canvas, barely visible, was a hint of color. Deep blue, like lapis lazuli. That's not water damage, one of the students whispered. That's paint. The work intensified. Over the following days, they exposed more of the wall, revealing fragments of the mural beneath. A piece of sky, the edge of what might be a figure. Colors that even faded and damaged were clearly the work of a master. Subtle gradations, careful layering, the kind of technique that couldn't be faked. Fairchild brought in a colleague from the Metropolitan Museum, a thin man named Dr. Westfield, who specialized in 19th century American art. He examined the exposed sections for hours, taking samples, comparing pigments, consulting reference books. Finally, he looked at Duncan with an expression of barely contained excitement. It's authentic Cross. The technique, the pigments, the canvas preparation, everything matches his documented methods. If the rest of the mural is intact beneath this plaster, you're looking at one of his largest surviving works. What's it worth? Garrett asked. Westfield hesitated. That's difficult to say. Cross murals rarely come to market. But a comparable piece sold at auction 5 years ago for $2.5 million. Given the size and apparent condition of this one, assuming it's complete, he paused. 3 to 4 million would be a conservative estimate. The number was so large it felt abstract. Duncan found himself unable to process it, as if his brain simply rejected the possibility. The exposure work continued for weeks. They worked in careful sections, documenting everything, preserving what they found. The mural slowly revealed itself, a garden scene with classical figures representing the seasons. A man and woman in the center, clearly meant to be portraits, surrounded by allegorical imagery. Time as an old man with an hourglass, memory as a woman with a mirror, love and loss as twin figures intertwined. The colors, even faded, were breathtaking. The composition was masterful. And slowly, Duncan began to understand what Wickham had commissioned. This wasn't just decoration. It was a narrative, the story of love, found, lost, remembered, and honored. It was Wickham's grief made beautiful. As word of the discovery spread, the attention intensified. A regional newspaper sent a reporter who wrote a front-page story. Local man's 47K castle purchase reveals hidden masterpiece. The article went viral online. Suddenly, Duncan was fielding calls from art dealers, museum curators, and investors. One evening, exhausted from another day of careful restoration work, Duncan sat alone in the library and tried to process what was happening. A month ago, he'd been living in a studio apartment, barely scraping by. Now he was sitting in a castle containing artwork worth millions, fielding offers from people he'd only read about in newspapers. His phone rang. Francine. "I just saw the article in the Times," she said. "Duncan, they're saying the mural alone could be worth $4 million. That's what the experts think. And the windows, and the woodwork, and everything else. Duncan, you could be worth $10 million. The number hung in the air between them. Finally, Francine spoke again, her voice softer. "I never should have doubted you. When you bought that place, I thought, well, it doesn't matter what I thought. I was wrong. You were being practical, looking out for me. No, I was being small-minded. You saw something I couldn't see. You trusted yourself when everyone else told you not to. That takes courage I didn't give you credit for." After they hung up, Duncan sat in the darkening library and thought about courage. Was it courage to risk your last dollar on a ruin? Or was it just desperation dressed up as vision? He honestly didn't know. What he did know was that somewhere in the past weeks, this had stopped being about proving himself to others and started being about something else. He'd found purpose in the restoration work, satisfaction in revealing the beauty beneath the decay. He'd reconnected with his son in a way he hadn't managed in years. He'd rediscovered the craftsman he thought he'd lost. The money was life-changing, certainly, but it wasn't what mattered most anymore. Dr. Fairchild returned with updated valuations. She'd consulted with auction houses and private collectors, gotten professional appraisals on every element of the castle. She laid out the numbers in the library, Garrett and Duncan listening in stunned silence. The Tiffany windows, 1.2 million, conservative estimate. The Vogel woodwork and architectural elements, 1.8 million. The cross mural, assuming we can complete the exposure and it's intact, 3.5 million. The property itself, with historical designation, 2.7 million. Total estimated value, she paused, $9.2 million. Garrett let out a breath. Duncan said nothing, the number too large to fit in his mind. "Now," Fairchild continued, "you have options. You could sell everything to a private collector or institution. You could sell individual elements and keep the property. You could pursue grants and donations to fund restoration and turn it into a museum or educational facility. But, Mr. Merrill, you need to make some decisions. Word is out now. You're going to have offers, pressure from all sides. You need to figure out what you want." After she left, Duncan and Garrett sat in the library as sunset turned the windows gold. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally, Garrett broke the silence. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking about Wickham," Duncan said. "About why he built this place. It wasn't about the money for him. It was about creating something beautiful out of grief, about making meaning from loss. And I don't want to just sell it off piece by piece. That feels wrong somehow, like we'd be destroying what he built. So what do you want to do? Duncan looked around the library, at the restored shelves, the clean windows, the careful work they'd done together. I want to finish what we started. I want to restore this place properly and find a way to share it. Make it mean something again. That's going to take money. A lot of money. I know. Duncan stood and walked to the window, looking out over the castle grounds. But maybe there's a way. Maybe if we're smart about it, we can have both. Preserve the castle and make it sustainable. Garrett joined him at the window. Then we better start planning. Because once those offers start coming in, the pressure is going to be intense. Duncan nodded. They had a castle worth millions, expertise that valued their discovery, and a decision that would define everything that came next. The hard part was just beginning. The offers started arriving within days. Phone calls, emails, formal letters on expensive letterhead, private collectors, museums, investment firms, even a Hollywood producer interested in turning the castle into a filming location. Each one represented more money than Duncan had ever imagined having, and each one felt increasingly wrong. One morning, while clearing overgrown vegetation from the castle's garden area, Duncan's shovel hit something metallic. He knelt and carefully excavated around it, revealing a tarnished silver locket half buried in the soil. It was heart-shaped, ornate, the kind of thing a woman might have worn a century ago. He cleaned it carefully with his sleeve. The latch was stubborn but eventually gave way. Inside were two photographs, faded but still visible. A stern-looking man with a magnificent moustache, and beside him, a woman with kind eyes and an elaborate hairstyle. On the other side were two younger people, presumably their children. Found something? Garrett approached, carrying pruning shears. Duncan showed him the locket. The Wickham family, I think. Must have been lost in the garden sometime before they left. Garrett examined it carefully. They were real people, with real lives. It's easy to forget that when you're talking about millions of dollars in artwork. That's exactly what I've been thinking. Duncan closed the locket gently. This was someone's home. Wickham built it, lived here, loved here. His family walked these halls. And now we're talking about stripping it for parts. They sat on the garden wall, surrounded by decades of overgrowth that was slowly yielding to their efforts. The morning sun warmed the stone, and somewhere in the castle, one of Fairchild's students was documenting another section of the mural. So what do we do? Garrett asked. We can't restore this place without serious capital. The roof alone is going to cost a fortune, and every day we wait, more damage happens. Duncan turned the locket over in his hands, feeling its weight. What if we found a way to preserve it that doesn't require selling everything? Something that honors what Wickham built while making it sustainable? Like what? I don't know yet, but there has to be a middle path between selling to the highest bidder and going bankrupt, trying to restore it ourselves. That afternoon, Dr. Fairchild arrived with a proposal. She found Duncan and Garrett in the main hall, where they were documenting water damage patterns. I've been thinking about your situation, she said without preamble, and I have an idea. The State Historical Society has been looking for a site to establish a restoration training program. Somewhere with authentic period features where students can learn traditional techniques hands-on. Duncan felt something shift in his chest. Go on. What if Thornhill Keep became that site? We'd help you establish a non-profit educational trust. The castle would be donated to the trust, which would protect it legally and make it eligible for grants and tax benefits. You and Garrett would be compensated through salaries as directors. The trust would fund restoration work while using it as a teaching opportunity. Would that actually work financially? Garrett asked. With proper planning, yes. The state has allocated funds for historical education initiatives. We could secure foundation grants, individual donations, potentially even corporate sponsorship. Plus, the courses themselves would generate revenue. Historic restoration is a growing field. People will pay to learn these skills. Duncan walked to the window, looking out at the grounds he and Garrett had been slowly reclaiming. A restoration school, a place where people could learn the same crafts that built this castle, where Wickham's vision could continue serving a purpose. "The mural stays?" he asked. "Everything stays. That's the point. The Tiffany windows become teaching tools. Students learn to evaluate and preserve authentic period glass. The Vogel woodwork demonstrates master-level joinery. The cross mural shows proper fresco technique. It all becomes part of the education. What about the property value? If we're sitting on $9 million, you'd be converting that value into a legacy instead of a bank account," Fairchild said. "The castle would be preserved in perpetuity. Your names would be associated with its restoration and continued use. And you'd have secure employment doing work that matters." Garrett was already pulling out his phone, taking notes. "We'd need a business plan. Enrollment projections, operating costs, revenue streams. I could work on that. I have contacts who specialize in non-profit development," Fairchild said. "They could help structure everything properly." "But Mr. Merrill," she looked at Duncan seriously, "this only works if you're committed. Half measures won't cut it. This would be your life's work." Duncan thought about the studio apartment he'd been living in, the handyman jobs that barely paid bills, the years of watching his life shrink. Then he thought about the past months, the satisfaction of restoration work, the reconnection with his son, the purpose he'd found in these stone walls. "I'm committed," he said. Over the next 2 weeks, they worked feverishly to develop the plan. Fairchild brought in consultants who specialized in educational nonprofits. They ran financial projections, developed curriculum outlines, identified potential funding sources. Garrett threw himself into the business side, revealing organizational skills Duncan hadn't known his son possessed. But there was a problem, and it came from an unexpected direction. While researching the property's legal history for the non-profit application, the attorneys discovered something troubling. The 1978 sale that had eventually led to Duncan purchasing the castle had never properly cleared probate. One of Wickham's descendants, a granddaughter who'd contested the sale, had died in 1995, but her own claim had apparently transferred to her children. The legal limbo had continued so long, everyone assumed it was resolved, but technically, those heirs might still have standing. The news hit Duncan like a physical blow. After everything, the discovery, the valuation, the planning, he might not even legally own the castle. "How is this possible?" Garrett demanded of the attorney. "Dad bought it in good faith. The title was supposedly clear. Title issues from decades-old probate cases are unfortunately common," the attorney explained. "The county record showed clear title, so your father wasn't negligent. But if the Wickham heirs come forward, they could contest ownership. And we just found out the place is worth $9 million, Duncan said quietly. "Once that's public knowledge, they'll definitely come forward," the attorney finished. "I recommend we try to locate them proactively. See if we can negotiate a settlement before they hear about the valuation." That night, Duncan sat alone in the castle's library, the silver locket on the desk in front of him. He'd risked everything on this place, spent his last dollar, invested months of work, reconnected with his son, built a vision for the future. And now it might all belong to someone else. The temptation to stay quiet was intense. If he just proceeded with the sale, moved quickly, maybe the heirs would never know what they'd missed. He could walk away with millions, set himself up for life, and no one would blame him. But he kept thinking about the letters they'd found, about Wickham building this castle as a memorial to love and loss, about doing something because it was right, not because it was profitable. He picked up his phone and called the attorney. "Find the Wickham heirs. Tell them everything, the purchase, the discoveries, the valuation, all of it. Mr. Merrill, I'd strongly advise against—" "I know," read them anyway. After he hung up, Duncan sat in the darkness and wondered if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. But somehow, sitting in Wickham's library, holding the locket that had belonged to his family, staying quiet felt like betraying everything this place represented. The castle had been built on love and integrity, Duncan would honor that, even if it cost him everything. The attorney located the Wickham heir within 3 days. Her name was Irene Lockwood, age 62, living in Portland, Oregon. She'd been a school teacher before retiring, widowed with 1 adult son. The attorney reported that she'd been shocked to receive the call and asked for time to process the information before responding. Duncan spent those waiting days in a fog of anxiety. He continued working on the castle. There was always work to be done, but his mind was elsewhere. Garrett tried to be optimistic, but even he grew quieter as the days passed. On the 4th day, Irene called. Her voice on the phone was measured, careful. "Mr. Merrill, I'd like to come see the castle. Can we arrange a meeting?" She arrived a week later with her son Perry, a business consultant in his mid-30s who had the sharp-eyed look of someone used to evaluating opportunities. Duncan and Garrett met them in the castle's main hall, the space they'd worked so hard to restore. Irene stopped just inside the entrance, her hand going to her mouth. She was a small woman with grey hair and her great-grandfather's eyes, the same eyes from the locket photograph. "Oh my," she whispered. "It's real. I always thought the family stories were exaggerated, but it's actually real." Duncan gave them a complete tour, holding nothing back. He showed them the Tiffany windows, the Vogel woodwork, the partially exposed cross mural. He shared the construction ledger, the letters they'd found, even the silver locket. Perry took notes constantly, his expression unreadable. Irene touched surfaces gently, as if greeting old friends. In the library, she paused by the window. "My grandmother used to tell me about this place, how her grandfather built it after his first wife died, how the family fought over it after he passed. She was ashamed of that, the fighting over money while this beautiful thing just sat here rotting." "Your grandmother was the one who contested the 1978 sale?" Duncan asked. Irene nodded. "She died, thinking she'd been cheated out of her inheritance. Spent 30 years bitter about it. I inherited that bitterness, I suppose, along with whatever legal claim she had. But I never pursued it because," she gestured around, "what was the point? I thought this place was gone." They sat in the library while the attorney explained the legal situation. The 1978 sale had technical problems in probate. Irene's mother had had standing to contest it, and that standing had transferred to Irene when her mother died. A court battle would be expensive and uncertain for both sides, but Irene definitely had a claim. Perry leaned forward. "Let me make sure I understand. My mother potentially has legal right to a property worth $9 million, and you voluntarily told us about it." "That's correct," Duncan said. "Why would you do that?" Duncan thought about Wickham's letters, about building something that lasted, about doing what was right even when it cost you. "Because hiding it would have been wrong." Perry sat back, studying Duncan with new interest. Irene was quiet for a long moment, then asked, "May I see those letters again?" "The ones from my great-grandfather?" Duncan retrieved the box from the study. Irene read through the letters slowly, tears sliding down her cheeks. When she finished, she carefully refolded them and placed them back in the box. "May I read you something?" She pulled out a small leather journal from her bag. "This was my great-grandfather's. It came to my grandmother, then to my mother, and finally to me. These are his last entries, written just weeks before he died." She opened to a marked page and read aloud. "I built this place from love, not vanity. I hope whoever walks these halls after I'm gone feels the peace I found here. A building is just stone and wood until someone gives it purpose. May it always serve those who need it most." The words hung in the air. Duncan felt something tighten in his chest. Irene closed the journal. "My family spent decades fighting over this place like vultures over a corpse. We forgot what it actually meant, what he wanted it to be." She looked at Duncan. "You've done more to honor my great-grandfather's vision in a few months than my family did in a century." "Mrs. Lockwood," Perry said carefully, "we should discuss this privately before—" "No." Irene's voice was firm. "I've made up my mind. Mr. Merrill, I'm going to deed whatever claim I have to you. Free and clear." Duncan couldn't speak. Garrett looked equally stunned. "Mom," Perry said, "you could be giving up millions of dollars. I could be ending a cycle of bitterness that's poisoned 3 generations of my family." Irene turned to her son. Your grandfather died angry about this place. Your grandmother died angry. I won't do the same. This castle should belong to someone who sees it as more than dollar signs. But surely some compensation, Perry tried. I do have one condition, Irene said to Duncan. The Wickham family history needs to be preserved. The letters, the journal, the locket, they stay with the castle. And whatever you do with this place, it should honor what my great-grandfather intended. Not locked away in some private collection, but shared somehow. Used for something meaningful, Duncan found his voice. We have a plan for that, a restoration school. We'd partner with the State Historical Society, teach traditional crafts, preserve everything while making it serve a purpose. Irene's face lit up. That's perfect. That's exactly what he would have wanted. Mrs. Lockwood, I can't just take... You're not taking anything. I'm giving it. There's a difference, she smiled. Besides, Mr. Merrill, you already risked everything for this place. You saw value where everyone else saw ruin. You trusted yourself when it would have been easier to give up. That takes a kind of wealth that has nothing to do with money. Perry looked at his mother, then at Duncan, then out at the castle grounds visible through the window. His expression shifted from calculation to something softer. All right, if we're doing this, let's do it right. I'm a business consultant. I can help you structure the non-profit, develop the business plan, make sure this thing is actually sustainable. You don't have to, Duncan started. I know, but Mom's right. My family's been fighting over this place for too long. Maybe it's time we helped build something instead. Perry pulled out his laptop. Let's talk numbers. What are your projected operating costs? Enrollment capacity? Revenue streams? Over the following days, they worked together to flesh out the plan. Perry brought a professional rigor that strengthened everything. He identified inefficiencies, suggested revenue opportunities they'd missed, and helped project realistic timelines. Irene contributed family archives, photographs, documents, stories that would enrich the castle's historical presentation. The attorney drew up the papers for Irene to formally release any claim to the property. She signed them in the library with Duncan, Garrett, Perry, and Dr. Fairchild as witnesses. It felt ceremonial, significant, like they were honoring something larger than any of them. That evening, after Irene and Perry had left to return to their hotel, Duncan and Garrett stood in the main hall. The space was quiet, the last light of day coming through the high windows. We almost lost everything, Garrett said. We would have deserved to, Duncan replied. If I'd stayed quiet, tried to hide it, that would have been theft, basically, built on dishonesty. Most people would have hidden it, maybe, but most people didn't read Wickham's letters, didn't see what he was trying to build here. Duncan looked around the hall, at the stone walls that had stood for over a century. He built from love, not greed. If we're going to honor that, we have to live it too. Garrett put his hand on his father's shoulder. I'm proud of you, Dad. What you did, telling them the truth, that took more courage than buying this place ever did. Duncan thought about courage, about integrity, about building things that lasted. The castle would outlive him, but the choice he'd made, to do what was right even when it cost him everything, that felt like the real foundation. Stronger than stone, more valuable than any appraisal. They'd almost lost it all. Instead, they'd gained something money couldn't buy. The knowledge that they'd earned what they had. The open house was set for 3 weeks out, enough time to finish exposing the mural, complete essential repairs, and prepare the castle for public viewing. The goal was ambitious: convince the town of Millersport, the county government, and potential donors that Thornhill Keep Restoration School was viable and worthy of support. Duncan threw himself into the work with renewed purpose. With Irene's legal release secured, the weight of uncertainty had lifted. Now it was just a matter of execution. He and Garrett worked 14-hour days, joined by Fairchild's graduate students and a rotating cast of volunteers that Francine had somehow recruited. The ballroom became their focus. After weeks of painstaking work, the mural was nearly fully exposed. The garden scene sprawled across the entire eastern wall, 20 feet high, 40 feet wide, rendered in colors that even faded were breathtaking. The central figures were clearly portraits of Wickham and his first wife. immortalized in an eternal garden, surrounded by allegorical representations of time, memory, love, and loss. Dr. Westfield from the Metropolitan Museum returned to oversee the final exposure and provide authentication documentation. He worked with reverent care, treating each revealed section like the treasure it was. "This is Cross's masterwork," he declared. Everything else he painted was practice for this. The composition, the technique, the emotional depth. It's extraordinary. The completed authentication would be crucial for the open house. Duncan had learned that people needed proof, documentation, expert validation. The story of a father's gamble paying off was compelling, but the non-profit would need hard evidence to secure grants and donations. Perry worked his own kind of magic with spreadsheets and projections. He'd created a comprehensive business plan that showed how the school could be sustainable within 3 years. His presentations were polished, professional, and persuasive, exactly what they'd need to convince skeptical town council members and potential funders. 1 week before the open house, Duncan commissioned a bronze plaque. He had it engraved with Wickham's final journal entry, the one about building with love and giving purpose to stone. It would be mounted in the main hall during the ceremony, a permanent reminder of why they were doing this. The physical preparation was demanding, but the emotional preparation was harder. Duncan would need to speak publicly, explain the vision, ask for support. Public speaking had never been his strength. He'd built things with his hands his whole life. Putting words together in front of a crowd felt like a different kind of construction entirely. Garrett sensed his father's anxiety. "You don't have to memorize a speech. Just tell them the truth. Tell them what you saw when you first walked in here. Tell them about Wickham, about what this place meant to him. Tell them why it matters." Duncan practiced in the library, Garrett listening patiently as he stumbled through explanations and lost his train of thought. Finally, Garrett stopped him. "Dad, you're overthinking this. What's the one thing you want them to understand?" Duncan thought about it. That this place is worth saving, not because of the money, but because of what it represents. Someone's love, someone's dream, someone's legacy. And that we have a chance to honor that while creating something useful. Then say that. Everything else is just details. 2 days before the open house, Duncan received unexpected visitors. Paulette and Stanford pulled up in Stanford's Mercedes, looking uncomfortable in their expensive casual wear. Duncan met them in the courtyard, wiping plaster dust from his hands. "We heard about the open house," Paulette said. "Thought we'd see if you needed any help." The offer surprised him. "I think we have it covered, but thank you." Stanford walked to the entrance and looked up at the tower. "I'll admit, when I first heard you'd bought this place, I thought—" He caught himself. "Well, it doesn't matter what I thought. You proved everyone wrong. Not everyone. Some people believed from the start." Duncan thought of Garrett, of Francine's quiet support, of Irene's generosity. Paulette touched his arm, the gesture tentative. "I was worried you were giving up. After the business, after everything. You seemed lost. I was lost. But being lost isn't the same as being finished. I can see that now." She looked at the castle, then back at him. "You found something here. More than just treasure in the walls. I found purpose. That's worth more than any appraisal." They didn't stay long, but something in the exchange felt like closure. Not reconciliation, too much had passed between them for that, but acknowledgement. A recognition that they'd both moved on to different lives, and that was okay. The day before the open house, the team did a final walkthrough. The main hall gleamed, the stonework cleaned, the floor swept, soft lighting installed to highlight architectural details. The library showcased historical displays about the Wickham family and the castle's construction. The ballroom presented the cross mural in all its restored glory, with educational materials explaining the artist's technique and significance. Professor Kendrick, the local historian who'd visited months ago, had prepared a presentation on Millersport's history and Thornhill Keep's place in it. Dr. Fairchild created displays showing the restoration process and the proposed educational programs. Perry assembled financial projections and impact studies showing the economic benefits to the community. Everything was ready. Now they just needed people to show up. That evening, Duncan walked through the castle alone. He'd sent everyone home to rest before the big day. The building was quiet, full of shadows and moonlight. He climbed to the tower room, a small circular space at the top of the eastern tower that they'd only recently made safe to access. From up there, he could see the whole valley. Millersport's lights twinkled in the distance. The forest stretched dark in every direction. The stars were brilliant, undimmed by city lights. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the desperation of that night in his studio apartment, scrolling through listings at 2 a.m, the fear of standing in front of this building the first time, every rational voice telling him to walk away. The months of work, the discoveries, the setbacks, the moments of doubt. He thought about Garrett, about how this project had given them something to build together, about Irene's generosity and Perry's unexpected partnership, about Fairchild's expertise and Francine's quiet faith, about all the people who'd chosen to believe in something that seemed impossible. Tomorrow, they'd ask the community to believe too, to invest not just money, but faith in a vision of restoration and education, preservation and purpose. It was a big ask. The town had mocked him for months. Winning them over would take more than just showing them a beautiful building. But as Duncan stood in that tower room, looking out over the valley, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not confidence exactly. He was too aware of all the things that could go wrong for that. But a kind of peace, a sense that regardless of what happened tomorrow, he'd already succeeded in the ways that mattered most. He'd trusted himself when everyone said not to. He'd chosen integrity over profit. He'd reconnected with his son. He'd found purpose after years of drifting. He'd proven, at least to himself, that 53 wasn't too late for a second act. Whatever happened tomorrow, that was already enough. Duncan descended from the tower and locked up the castle. As he drove back to his apartment, he'd move into the castle's residential quarters next month if everything went according to plan. He felt ready, not for what might happen, but for whatever would happen. He'd built something here, something that would outlast him, just like his father taught him, just like Wickham had done a century before. A craftsman builds things that last. Tomorrow, they'd find out if what they'd built was strong enough to stand. The morning of the open house arrived with perfect autumn weather, clear skies, comfortable temperature, golden light that made the castle's stonework glow. Duncan arrived at dawn to find Garrett already there, arranging chairs in the main hall. "And couldn't sleep," his son admitted. "Figured I might as well be useful." They worked together in comfortable silence, making final preparations. Francine arrived early with her husband, bringing coffee and pastries. Dr. Fairchild came with her students to set up displays. Perry checked and rechecked the presentation equipment. Professor Kendrick rehearsed his remarks in the library. By 1 o'clock, people began arriving. Duncan watched from a second-floor window as cars filled the makeshift parking area they'd cleared in the grounds. More cars than he'd dared hope for. Families from town, people he recognized from the hardware store and the diner, county officials in their Sunday clothes, reporters with cameras and notebooks. Betsy from the diner found him as he descended the stairs. "Mr. Merrill, I have to tell you, I never thought you'd pull this off. When you first bought this place, I thought you'd lost your mind. I think a lot of people did. Well, I'm happy to admit I was wrong. This is remarkable." Horace from the hardware store brought his granddaughter, a college student studying architecture. She wandered through the spaces with wide eyes, photographing details and asking intelligent questions about the restoration techniques. Horace stood a little straighter, proud to have a connection to the project. Even Priscilla, the real estate agent, approached Duncan with something like humility. "I sold you this property, thinking it was just the land value. I had no idea what you were actually buying. That takes vision I didn't give you credit for." Duncan accepted the apologies graciously, harboring no resentment. They'd all reacted reasonably to what looked like a terrible decision. He'd been the one who saw something different. That wasn't their failing. It was his gift. At 2 o'clock, Garrett called everyone to the main hall for the formal presentation. Over 200 people crowded into the space, more than they'd prepared for. Duncan felt his pulse quicken as he stood before them, Garrett beside him, their prepared remarks suddenly feeling inadequate. He began simply, "Thank you all for coming. 3 months ago, I bought this castle with my last $47,000. Most of you thought I was making a mistake. Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. I'm not sure you were wrong to think that. It was a risk, a big one. But standing here now, I can tell you what I saw that night when I first found the listing online. He gestured around the hall. I saw someone's dream, someone's love made solid in stone and wood and glass. I saw craftsmanship and care and purpose. I saw something worth saving. He told them about Wickham, about the letters and the ledger and the mural, about Cross and Tiffany and Vogel, artists and craftsmen whose work had survived a century, about how close it all came to being lost forever. But this isn't just about the past, Duncan continued. It's about the future. My son Garrett and I, along with Dr. Fairchild from the State Historical Society, have developed a plan to turn Thornhill Keep into a restoration school, a place where people can learn traditional crafts while preserving this building and its treasures. Garrett stepped forward to explain the business model, the partnerships, the funding sources, the economic impact on Millersport. Perry presented the projections, showing sustainability and growth. Professor Kendrick spoke about historical significance. Dr. Fairchild described the educational mission. The presentation was polished, professional, compelling. But Duncan could see some faces in the crowd remained skeptical. Town council members exchanged glances. A few older residents whispered to each other. They'd need more than just a good presentation. Then Irene stepped forward, introduced herself as Ambrose Wickham's great-granddaughter, and the room went completely silent. She told the story of her family's bitter disputes, of the decades wasted fighting over inheritance, of how Duncan's integrity had broken that cycle. This man could have hidden the truth, she said, her voice steady. He could have sold everything before my family ever knew what we'd missed. Instead, he chose honesty. He chose to honor what my great-grandfather built. That tells you everything you need to know about whether this project deserves your support. She opened the time capsule they'd found in the cornerstone. Construction. Documents, newspapers from 1887, coins, and most significantly Wickham's letter to future generations. Irene read it aloud, her voice breaking slightly at the end. When she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the hall. Duncan mounted the bronze plaque with those same words permanently on the wall, Irene helping him secure it. The moment felt historic, purposeful, exactly right. The formal presentation concluded with a standing ovation that caught Duncan completely off guard. People rose from their chairs, applauding not just politely but genuinely, enthusiastically. He looked at Garrett, who was grinning and wiping his eyes. As the crowd dispersed to tour the castle, something shifted. The skepticism Duncan had sensed earlier had transformed into curiosity, even excitement. People weren't just looking at the building anymore. They were seeing the possibility. The town council members gathered around Perry, asking detailed questions about the business model and economic projections. A county commissioner pulled Duncan aside to discuss tax incentives for historical education facilities. 2 local business owners offered to sponsor student scholarships. Horace approached with his contractor friend, a man Duncan had worked with years ago on construction jobs. "We were talking," Horace said. "You're going to need ongoing maintenance, repairs, that kind of thing. We'd like to offer our services at cost. Consider it an investment in the community." Betsy cornered Garrett with a proposal to cater future workshops and events. "Good food, reasonable prices. I could use the steady business, and you'll need to feed those students." Dr. Fairchild was surrounded by educators and history enthusiasts asking about enrollment, curriculum, and volunteer opportunities. She fielded questions with practiced ease, but Duncan could see the excitement in her eyes. This was becoming real. In the ballroom, people stood in awed silence before the cross mural. Dr. Westfield had stationed himself there to answer questions, and he was holding court like a professor with eager students. The late afternoon light, coming through the windows, illuminated the painting perfectly, and Duncan heard more than one person gasp at its beauty. An elderly woman approached Duncan as he stood near the mural. She had kind eyes and moved with careful dignity. "I'm Dorothy Hayes," she said. "I'm 87 years old, and I remember when this castle was first built. Well, not built. I'm not quite that old, but I remember it when I was a girl, before the Wickham family left. My father did carpentry work in town, and he'd bring me by to see it sometimes. He called it the most beautiful building he'd ever seen." "It is beautiful," Duncan agreed. "I never thought I'd see it restored. I assumed it would eventually be torn down, and that would be that. But you've brought it back." She touched his arm gently. "Thank you for that. Thank you for caring enough to see what was here." The simple gratitude in her words hit Duncan harder than any of the business proposals or official interest. This mattered to people, not because of money or education or economic development, though those things were important. It mattered because beauty matters, because history matters, because some things are worth saving just because they're worth saving. As evening approached, most guests departed, but a core group remained. Duncan, Garrett, Francine, Irene, Perry, Fairchild, Kendrick, and a handful of volunteers who'd become invested in the project. They gathered in the library, exhausted but energized. "The town council wants a formal proposal by the end of the month," Perry reported. "But the chair told me privately they're inclined to support it. The economic development angle sold them. The State Historical Society is prepared to commit funding for the first year," Fairchild added. "And I've got 3 foundations interested in endowment grants. We had 17 people sign up for the mailing list about course enrollment," Garrett said, scrolling through his tablet. "And that's just today. Once we officially announce we're actually doing this," Francine interrupted, looking around at all of them. "This is actually going to happen." Duncan felt it too, the shift from possibility to reality. They'd cleared the biggest hurdle. The community was behind them. The pieces were falling into place. Irene raised a glass of the champagne someone had brought. To second chances and the courage to take them. They all raised their glasses, toasting in the library where Duncan had spent so many quiet hours planning and hoping. After the others left, Duncan and Garrett remained. They walked through the castle one more time, seeing it through fresh eyes. The clean stones, the restored woodwork, the preserved treasures, all of it representing months of faith and labor. "You did it, Dad," Garrett said quietly. "Everyone said you were crazy, but you did it." "We did it," Duncan corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." They stood together in the main hall, the bronze plaque gleaming on the wall, Wickham's words promising that the castle would serve those who needed it most. Duncan had needed it. Needed the purpose, the challenge, the chance to prove he wasn't finished. And the castle had given him all that and more. He ran his hand along the stone wall, feeling the solidity, the permanence, the rightness of it all. This was what it meant to build something that lasted. Not just the stone and wood, but the meaning behind it. They'd built something here, something real, something that would outlast them both. And that was exactly enough. 3 months later, early autumn painted the valley in shades of gold and rust. The first session of Thornhill Keep Restoration School was in progress. 15 students gathered in the East Wing learning stonework restoration techniques. Duncan moved among them, offering guidance, correcting techniques, answering questions with the patience of someone who'd finally found his calling. "The mortar mix has to match the original," he explained to a young woman struggling with proportions. "Too much cement, and it's stronger than the stone, causes damage over time. You want it just strong enough, no stronger?" She nodded, adjusting her mixture. Duncan watched her work for a moment, satisfied, then moved to the next student. Teaching came naturally to him. He'd spent decades in construction, absorbing knowledge from his father and from experience. Now he was passing it forward, and the satisfaction ran deeper than any paycheck ever had. Garrett managed operations from the converted office space, fielding enrollment inquiries and coordinating with partner organizations. The winter courses were already full, and they were developing a waiting list for spring. The demand had exceeded even Perry's optimistic projections. The castle itself had transformed. The roof was completely repaired, preventing further water damage. The windows were secured, the structural issues addressed, the most critical restoration work completed. It would take years to fully restore every room, but that was fine. The building itself was the classroom now, each space revealing lessons about craft and care and building things properly. Duncan and Garrett lived in the restored residential quarters on the third floor. Father and son sharing meals, conversations, a life they were building together. Their relationship had healed in ways Duncan hadn't thought possible. The distance that had grown between them over the years of his failures had closed during the months of shared purpose. One morning, Irene visited with her grandchildren, showing them the castle that their ancestor had built. Duncan gave them a private tour, explaining the history, showing them the family letters and photographs they'd preserved in display cases. Great-great-great-grandpa built this? The youngest asked, eyes wide. He did, Irene said. And Mr. Merrill saved it. Duncan shook his head. Your great-great-great-grandfather saved it. He built something so well with such care that it could survive a century of neglect. I just uncovered what was already here. They visited the garden where Duncan had found the locket. He'd planted flowers there, slowly reclaiming the space from decades of overgrowth. The locket itself was displayed in the library, alongside the letters and Wickham's journal, fragments of lives lived, preserved for future generations. Professor Kendrick had partnered with the school to offer history courses, bringing university students to study on site. Dr. Fairchild visited regularly, her graduate students treating the castle as a living laboratory. The partnerships were thriving, exactly as they'd hoped. Even the town of Millersport had embraced the project. The school brought visitors, students, scholars, people who needed places to stay, meals to eat, supplies to buy. The economic impact was modest but real, and the town took quiet pride in having something unique within its borders. One evening, Duncan stood alone in the main hall. The students had gone home. Garrett was in town meeting with a potential donor, and the building was quiet. He read the bronze plaque they'd mounted, Wickham's words about building with love and giving purpose to stone. Duncan thought about his own journey. The divorce, the failed business, the years of feeling washed up and worthless, the desperate gamble on a moss-covered castle that everyone called a mistake. The discoveries, the risks, the choices that had brought him here. He'd proven something to himself, though it wasn't quite what he'd set out to prove. Not that he was still capable, he'd always been capable, but that having capacity mattered less than having courage. That being willing to trust yourself, to risk everything on vision over certainty, to choose integrity over profit, those were the things that actually defined a person. The money had been life-changing, certainly. The financial security, the successful non-profit, the sustainable mission, all of it mattered. But what mattered most was standing in this hall, knowing he'd honored Wickham's legacy, reconnected with his son, and built something that would serve people long after he was gone. He heard footsteps on the stairs, Garrett returning, calling out about the meeting, about the donor who'd committed to funding 3 full scholarships. Duncan turned from the plaque smiling. Tomorrow, they'd teach another class, welcome more students, continue the work of preservation and education. The castle would stand for decades more, maybe centuries, serving the purpose they'd given it. Sometimes a man reaches a point where he has to prove he's still worth something. Duncan Merrill had found that proving it to himself was all that ever mattered. And in that discovery he'd found everything.